What tradition historical criticism seeks to do is take observations of both source and form criticism and collect it in terms of analyzing a tradition historical process, right? So they introduced two new categories to the discussion. One is traditium, and the other is traditio. Traditium, they would say, is the particular tradition content that is passed down. So it might be a literary source or it might be an oral source, right? They want to kind of do both here. And then they seek to analyze that in terms of traditio, which is the process of that transmission. And so they kind of join together both source and form criticism with a lens toward historical progress and how these things are reflected in later epochs in the Bible.
Right.
I will say tradition historical criticism is not a monolithic school, if you can even call it a school of thought. It's actually quite broad. Um, on the one hand, you can have works of guys like von Rad, who engage in tradition historical criticism from a very broad perspective. Right, they'll cover tradition material, traditium, in any sense that it might come up, and have a very broad-looking traditio, even going maybe beyond the biblical narrative. But there's also a much more narrow version of tradition historical criticism reflected in guys like Michael Fishbane, where what they want to deal with is not traditium behind the biblical text, but they kind of see the biblical text as a crystallized traditium itself. And the traditio that they then want to reflect upon is how the biblical text is then picked up and used in later biblical texts. So this is how Michael Fishbane bridges together tradition historical criticism with interbiblical interpretation. Because what he will do is he will see earlier biblical narratives or early biblical texts as traditium, crystallized traditium, that are then picked up in a later biblical text. And the process of traditio is analyzing those two textual points, you could say, of crystallized traditium. And so, which that one is much more helpful, I think, than the other, which is getting much more pretextual in terms of traditium. And so this one, I think I even would refrain from calling it much of a school of criticism, or maybe even not calling it a method of criticism, but just saying something more like posing different questions to
Yeah.
the already preceding critical assumptions.